Edward Locke is one of those artists whose creations slice across the artificial boundaries we use to define art. Some of you may have first heard of him through his collaboration with the rock star David Bowie. It was Locke who worked as artistic director on Bowie's concert tour, Sound and Vision. But Edward Locke also has a large following in the dance world. He weaves together film, an acrobatic movement, and video and dance to create an electrifying theatrical event. Edward Locke is an exotic creature. His family immigrated to Montreal from Morocco when he was a child, and perhaps that explains the indefinable quality which pervades his work. He expresses himself through complex dance forms that just can't be categorized. In order to convey his intense and unique choreography, Edward Locke seems to have sculpted his dancers out of human flesh. His female dancers appear just as strong as the men, and his works are characterized by an onslaught of energy. His lead dancer, Louise Le Cavalier, literally throws herself around the stage. Yet in contrast, Locke himself seems remarkably calm and conveys his ideas in an eloquent and almost formal style. Intelligent and gifted, Edward Locke is a fascinating spokesman for his art.
I wanted to be a writer. I got into dance almost as a side thing because my social life was absolutely nil. It still is. My whole teenage years was typical nerd teenage years where you have these ideas that are massive and full of nuance, and when somebody asks you a question, you sort of go like, yep. And there was this huge discrepancy between what I had in my mind and what was actually coming out of my mouth, which created frustration, which I think a lot of teenagers can understand. Not that I'm a teenager anymore. Anyway, one of the side courses that I took was theater. And I took it not knowing dance was part of the package. And halfway through the semester, I found that out and reacted as someone who barely had danced at high school, had absolutely no dance knowledge at all. So anyway, I looked at it with kind of perplexed amazement. And I think as with everything, it's the person that introduces you to the concept that makes or breaks this for you. And that professor had something about her. She was able to get some of the enthusiasm she felt for the art form communicated to people who were outlandishly not suited to dance. She just managed to make you discover your potential physically in a way that was absolutely non-judgmental. It was fun. You didn't try to prove anything in that class. So eventually I started liking this thing. I really wasn't banking on this developing into anything. I just happened to like this new feeling of being essentially, of moving without having any goals. So I just got involved on a purely personal pleasure level. See, the basic thing me and Louise have in common together is that regardless of the heat, the temperature, or the climatic conditions, we always wear a jacket or a coat. See, this is about 80 degrees right now, and this woman is walking around with a coat. Look at this coat. And I'm walking around with a jacket, and it's lined. This is a lined leather jacket. And people are used to this, but for you guys in Toronto, I always dress for cold, regardless. There's something inherently complex about how people move in very ordinary, everyday situations. They don't realize it because we're a very verbal society and we have lost the sensation of how complex movement is. But essentially, The only point at which a thought exists in the pure abstract is when it's not communicated. When you have a thought that you keep to yourself, then it is a purely abstract thought. At any point when you desire to communicate that thought, you have to communicate it using muscles, bone, air, visuals, and then it's no longer abstract and no longer as complex, but it's understandable. And dance is one of the few art forms, along, I suppose, with music and painting, that remains relatively complex and therefore also relatively not understood. I think that was something that attracted me to it because I was a solitary person. I was full of thoughts and I was never able to communicate them very well. How I got into choreography was a chance in a million, really. I mean, I just took every single class there was in Toronto, Montreal, New York that I knew about. And at some point, one of the companies that was in Montreal, the artistic director had left and there was this sort of absence. And I started getting together with some dancers. And I just got together with them in the studio and started developing this dance in the mornings before classes took over in the afternoon. And at some point, the artistic director of that company, Nouvelle Air, poked her head into the studio one day and liked what she saw. And all of a sudden, it got to be a serious project. I never went through the stage of actually being a dancer in a company. I went directly from student to choreographer. I was expected to come up with pieces at regular intervals. And nobody questioned it. It was sort of, okay, so this is the next one. And then that led to the first piece in 1980 of the company on the massive sum of $5,000, which I sort of managed not to pay the dancers with and, and get the decor and the piece and the commissions and presented it 3 weeks in Montreal and 1 week at the Kitchen in New York. And the Kitchen in New York at that time was a big thing. I mean, it was one of the, I think we were the first Canadians to be invited to that place. There was a lot of contradiction in the work. The audience wasn't taken by the hand. They were sort of barraged with images of all sorts, and like it was happening in my mind. And some people said, no, we don't like this. And other people said, yes, we like it. But nobody said, it's like so-and-so. A lot of people took cognizance of the company around 1985 when it started doing Businessman in the process of becoming an angel, followed by Human Sex, followed by New Demons. Because those were the years when we started touring a lot. But prior to that, we worked the same amount of time to create the work, we just toured it a couple of months at the most. So a lot of people actually have no idea what I was doing between 1975 and 1984. And the work was radically different. When I was working at Nouvelle Air, going back to the first pieces, they were extremely lyrical. Very soft, lyrical pieces. I was working with composers like Harry Summers, Canadian composers. I was a gutsy kid too, because I had no idea how to reach Harry Summers. I certainly couldn't afford Harry Summers' fee. So I phoned up. I got his number, I don't know by what means, and phoned up and got his maid and said, could you, this is Edward Locke, and could he give me back? He wouldn't have had a clue as to who I was. But he was nice enough to phone back, and I told him, you know, I'd really like to do something on this piece of music. So he sent me a partition. I had to call him back and say, this partition is absolutely no use to me. I need a tape. So he did. It was very nice of him. Anyway, so they were very soft lyrical pieces, and they gradually started to go a bit crazy. I think I wanted to find a way of showing how extreme the thought process was by physicalizing it. That was my main motor towards a more extreme style of movement. The other thing that influenced me was some discussions I had with painters, where they were saying, how can you as an artist be interested in dance? And I sort of went, why? And they said, well, because you have no potential of abstraction in this art form. You're dealing with a body type that is inflexible, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. That can never change. As a painter, I can reformat, recreate reality at my own whim. You can't. So therefore, you're stuck in realism forever. And I think they were wrong, and they were making one major mistake I think a lot of people make. There's seeing and there's thinking, and the two are seen to be the same, when in fact they're very separate. When a child looks, he looks without any preconceived notions of what he's seeing. He has no input in memory that tells him this thing is like that. That's why children are one of the worst audiences for magicians. They'll always look in the wrong place and catch the trick, and more mature audiences will do what they're supposed to be doing. They've already got preconceived notions of how to react to things. And I felt that at some point you could overload this sense, this memory. You could throw enough information at it that memory would just cut out, and the eye for 5 seconds, 10 seconds in a performance would be free, would actually see something in a totally free way. And that's a wonderful feeling. If you're walking down the street these days, you're bombarded with a lot of different types of signals. This is no longer a pure environment. One does not see only one thing at a time. This is part of urban dwelling, and I enjoyed the idea of presenting the best dance I could craft in an environment that would compete with it, where an audience could potentially decide to look at a musician, could potentially decide to look at an environment rather than look at the dance. I guess I like the idea of an audience choosing as opposed to being led. Contrary to film, where the editing defines what you're going to see, the editor decides you're going to see a close-up of the person now, you're going to see zoom, you're going to see a pan, whatever. They guide your eye. The theater process is full of information, and you can potentially, depending on your personal choice, see a very different show from the one your neighbor is looking at. So you can end up creating an extreme statement, an exciting statement, and it can backlash right into you, and people get very upset at you and call you names. That's part of what I think is successful theater. I think if you can involve an audience, as opposed to guide them into necessarily a positive reaction to the work, then something's happening. I think the worst thing is when people just sort of go out there the same way they came in.
Leg overs, your leg, I go here, down, 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 here, this is okay, here, we flatline here. Okay.
One thing we do is create dance without music. It's done in silence. We started working without music because we started working with composers. And composers work at a really slow pace. So they would give us music very close to the point at which the product was finished. And so we never really had an option. I mean, unless you go and buy a tape and do something on pre-recorded music, if you deal with a composer and ask them to create a score for you, they'll take a while to come up with it. And during that time, I mean, you have to create something. So eventually I got into the situation where I was creating a dance without knowing the piece of music that was going to actually be put on it, which didn't bother me that much because that's how film works. An actor will recite a line, and then the editor will place music on it, and that line will take intonations, which the actor had no idea would happen because he had no idea of the kind of musical environment he'd be placed in. Hitchcock did something like that once. He did, he shot the same scene 3 times, or rather he had the same scene 3 times, but put different pieces of music, and the scene oscillated from being dramatic to being scary to being happy, depending on the kind of music that was played. Another example of that was in 1987 or around there, the Bolshoi Ballet came into Quebec for Rendezvous 87. And we were, by some person had a strange sense of humor, and they placed our pas de deux right after theirs. And they were doing this thing on Spartacus, a very lyrical pas de deux, and then we zoomed in there with one from Human Sex, which was probably the most extreme one we had in the show. And I remember talking to the interpreter, because I was wondering, how would this pas de deux look like? What would it look like on a Khachaturian score? So since we're back-to-back, I asked them, could they rewind the tape and replay the same piece of music, and we just go and interpret our based on their music. And we did it, and I remember the reactions of quite a few people coming up to me after and saying, I'm glad, Edward, you're getting more lyrical. I'm glad you're softening up. Everybody's conscious of the fact that men and women are politically equal, but they're still not seen as being physically equal, movement-wise equal. One still expects a more extreme type of movement coming from a man than one does from a woman. And at that point, the women in the company were doing very extreme movement. And people were reacting in very strange ways to that. Some of them were actually doubting that they were women. Others were saying, yes, they're women, but they're very strange women. It was not, well, this is just a choice that the woman is making. And that drove home to me a big difference in people's concept of what was equal and what was not. One of the things that struck me as being particularly strange was that they were all shocked by the fact that Louise could lift a man over her head. But this is an illusion. A man has to cooperate very closely for a woman to lift him. Then again, the woman has to cooperate extremely well with the man for her to be lifted. Any woman that doesn't want to be lifted by a man will not be lifted by a man, or at least to his great risk and peril. So one illusion was accepted as being normal. The other illusion was not. People were not commenting on the fact that the men were making extreme movements. They almost felt that was to be natural, but the women actually made the company into an extreme dance statement. If the women in the company had been more staid, I think the company would have been seen as considerably more conventional. Theater used to be this extreme place. I mean, it used to be this forum of the people. They used to come in and voice very clearly what they thought. And now it's become this really nice place where people dress up and they go and they sit down and they have nice dinner after or before, whatever, and they... And it's seen as very bad to actually not clap. And people will look at people who boo or walk out in a very negative way, even if they don't like the piece, because it's just not done. I think you can lose a sense of what theater is about. I think part of theater is the audience, and I think to involve them is good. And if the involvement means they don't like it and they get vociferous about it, so be it.
Edouard Locke, the founder and choreographer of La 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 Human Steps. Now, here's an exciting work he's created for video featuring the dancers Louise Le Cavalier and Marc Bellon. Though the astonishing energy of Locke's work seems punishing for the dancers, its electricity leaves us wanting more. I'll be back